So with that, I'd like to introduce Teresa. And Teresa works for the Calgary Board of Education. She is a dedicated trauma-informed educator with over 20 years of experience working with children and adolescents. Her experience spans public and private education, elementary, junior, and senior high divisions, as well as segregated and inclusive settings. From her vantage point as a classroom teacher, Calgary Board of Education behavior strategist, mental health specialist, and most recently, assistant principal in unique setting for students diagnosed with severe externalizing behaviors, Teresa sees how to link emerging brain-based science with best teaching practice. Teresa?
Well, first I just want to say it's the last day of school. And so, yeah, woo! So I'm a little exhausted and I realize I'm losing my voice heading into my summer cold, so that should be tomorrow. So, but I'm going to do my best here to, in a very short period of time, cover quite a bit of material. But one of the things that I want to just say is really the point of what I'm going to talk about is how do we, I'm going to get this thing going here. How are we going to link some of that science information, which has been so helpful in my own practice, to the school setting, and look at a couple of really simple frames on how do we help the professionals that we're working with look at those things, and then also taking a little bit of a look at the education model itself and some of the challenges and entry points when we are trying to look at ways to bring this information into schools. And in a lot of ways, what I'm going to talk about is going to set the context for Margaret to follow up. We tend to present together, so Margaret as a mental health professional and myself as an educator, and so we just play off each other, so it's a little weird for me to be up here without knowing she's going to jump in and take over when need be. So. But the most important bit of information really is that there's absolutely no question that those rich, healthy environments are best, right? And that's what we would wish for every child before they enter school, is that they've had that exposure. We know that that creates better results for learners. So the reality is that a high percentage, I shouldn't say a high percentage, a percentage of students coming in have high ACEs or adverse childhood experiences before entering school, which can create a deficit for learning. If we're going to add in some of those low social economic status, and maybe even that, I want to learn more from Tom about the social subordination piece. I think that's really interesting as well to see how that plays out in the school. But I think definitely when you start to put these pieces together, we see kids at more of a disadvantage for learning. So when I first started to hear about some of this science, my thoughts were that really what I needed to do as a strategist working with adults for the first time was that I needed to get in and really help people understand how to target that individual student that we were worried about. And I was having a bit of a low success rate with that. So started to look at why that might be. So I'm working off notes here today, guys, so pardon the page flipping. But what we did, Margaret and I had our info management department pull out just some random classrooms for us to take a look at, a bit of a cross-section of what was happening in classrooms so we could share that with you. And even we were surprised when we saw it kind of in black and white like that. So what I've done here is taken a class of 24, and I haven't really changed the number of identified needs in the classroom, but I did change the type of need just to give us a better sense of maybe the cross-section. So in this classroom, this kind of fictitious classroom with some basis in reality, the top corner is FASD, so fetal alcohol syndrome. First Nation, Métis or Inuit students, there's a couple in there. Several English language learners in our city in classrooms. Some dual diagnoses, so kids coming out with a diagnosis of we call them code 42 or severe behavior, with ADHD, and down at the bottom also with learning disabilities. Quite common to see those kind of mixes. Kids with learning disabilities, perhaps cognitive delays in the elementary classroom, autism spectrum disorder, and communication. So these are a sample of things that could be present in the classroom. And when we look at that, and when we're saying, well, you know, why don't you just kind of take care of this kid that we're worried about? It becomes really clear, right? The complexity of the classrooms is very, very challenging. So when we looked at junior high and senior high, the numbers decreased a bit. This was about, I didn't write it down, about 80%, Margaret. And so when we looked at junior high, we were looking about 56% of additional needs, and we pulled some gym classes so that we'd have a real cross-section of the school for junior high and for senior high, and then about 27% in high school. So we do see a drop, and there's probably all kinds of reasons for that, but I don't have time, so I'm going to keep going. But it was really, it's interesting, right? And so when we're trying to look at how are we creating these environments, sometimes teachers don't even know beyond these are identified kids, how many unidentified kids are coming in with high adverse childhood experiences that haven't shown up in any paperwork kind of manner. So the question is, how do we help the adults to start to look at how do you create an environment that's going to be great for all of these kids, whoever shows up through your door, okay? So what we needed to look at was looking at some frames of reference that we could put in place to help adults understand what the makeup of the classroom might be like, and what is some of the things that they're seeing, what is some of the rationale behind that, or the reasoning behind it, sorry. So one of the first ones, working with the psychology team, it's been really helpful as an educator to be working with psychology. I learned that there are 7 domains of impairment that can be related to some of that toxic stress and adversity that we alluded to this morning. And so areas are listed up here. The attachment piece is huge on how kids are able to attach, all the way down to number 7 with the self-concept. So what we might see is in a student, maybe they've got problems with boundaries. There could be a high level of distrust of the adults or other kids. Maybe they're not participating in the classroom. Physical contact can be a trigger, so we're talking about the importance of touch. Well, some kids, by the time they're in school, that touch can be a really adverse experience and can create some big responses. They have trouble perhaps expressing or controlling their emotions, and also following rules, and most importantly with learning, right? We're in the business of teaching and learning and education. So if you've got multiple children fluctuating between all kinds of challenges daily, then knowing that this is happening isn't really enough, right? So just having that knowledge that there's kids coming to school with lots of challenges and lots of impairments doesn't really help us help the student. So I had a video that we were going to try to show you. We had some technical difficulties with it, but Hillary's going to send the link. But the reason I wanted to show it to you, and it's really about the fight, flight, and freeze response, and it's a really good depiction of that. And I wanted to show it to you because the piece is that we have to help to start the educators and the professionals understand in a basic way what is it that we're talking about when we're talking about this complex science, okay? So the link will be sent to you guys and you can take a look at it. It's a little creepy, I'll tell you that up front, because they got these little cartoon characters with these freaky eyes, but so don't be scared, but the message is awesome, so do take time to look at that. So I'll just skip past that into what the survival response in schools looks like. And so that's your fight, flight, and freeze. So we might see for a student that's going to that fight place, hyperactivity, the verbal aggression, oppositional behavior, all of those. The flight might be more of that shutting down or withdrawing, escaping, right? They're avoiding work and other things. And then the freeze is that shutting down emotionally. Okay, where we're kind of lights are on, nobody's home. How do we reach these kids? In the classroom, these things can be interpreted as disengagement, laziness, aggression, and that can affect staff engagement, right? So if you're kind of looking, again, I was hoping to hear a little bit more from Tom around that piece, but if your staff engagement is down, then what's the effect long-term for kids in school, right? So, great news. The great news is the plasticity information has been really helpful in my practice and in education to understand that we're not kind of set. There was kind of a thought, you know, you come in the door in grade 1 with whatever you're dealing with, and you're going to go out in grade 12 with sort of those same abilities. And the learning that we've had is that we've got room for change. We've got room to be looking at building those executive functioning and still building that prefrontal cortex, even if there's a deficit coming in. Agreed, we always want it to be prior, right? The best case scenario is that prenatal and before they ever come to school, but it's not our reality. So we got to keep kind of focused on that and working forward through it. So we can look at it instead of as an unsolvable problem, but an opportunity for continued growth and learning, which is super exciting. Okay, 5 minutes. All right, so first we have to look beyond the classroom to that whole school system. Okay, and I think that's where I was getting caught up when I first started, was going in and narrowing in on the student that I was advocating for and working within that classroom. And it's really important to look at the whole school system and remembering that it's like an orchestra. So there's many specialized players throughout an entire school system, and to be in harmony, all the players must be in tune and highly skilled. And therein lies the challenge. So how do we keep the system informed and updated on current research related to student learning? Right? We've got a lot of players, and they're listed kind of there at the bottom, just a cross-section, right? We've got board of trustees, we've got parents, we've got legal departments, we've got bus drivers and lunch supervisors, along with our students and teachers, and psychologists, our OTs and PTs, who are bringing in the brushing into school, which is really great to see. So all of those players are together, and if they don't have the same information, it's really hard to gain momentum. Right? So our message, I think, is around how do we look at that? So one way we can look at that is through the RTI model, and the RTI model came out of an academic model around LD and so on, which we do not have time for. But in the behavioral model, at the bottom, we're looking at that 80 to 85%. It says 95 on here, but the 80 to 85 is talking about those kind of dandelion children, right? Where they're going to do well in the systems that we've got set up. The better system we have set up, the better, but they're going to do okay. At Tier 2, we're looking at at-risk kids who may need some further interventions. And then at the top of the triangle there, it's about 1 to 5% of students who are really going to need intensive individualized supports. Okay? So what we did was we took a look at it through the lens of that orchestra with all the different parts that need to be together. If we're looking at students, if they're at the top, they may have no experience or exposure to playing an instrument or to being in an orchestra. So we're at a real deficit there. At Tier 2, they might be putting it together, but they're going to need some more practice and support to get there. And at the bottom are your competent and talented musicians who are just, you throw them the music and they start playing. Okay? So if we look at the adults as well, and we start to figure out, okay, if we want to create that really great universal environment at the bottom, if the caregivers and professionals have little to no exposure on recent research-informed interventions, they're at that top level, right? At the middle, they may have been introduced already to things like brain architecture, serve and return, toxic stress, executive function, resilience. All of those things might be knowledge that they have. But in order to create that environment, the application of the scientific theory has to be mastering teaching to any of those identified deficits, right? And there needs to be time for that. So you get the information, you need to process it, you need to figure out how you're going to apply it within the setting. So, and if you're only one person in a school building that has that information, it can be challenging. So how do we get that to everybody? Okay? Oh, I've gone too far. Oh, I think just the one other thing that I wanted to say is making sure that we understand sort of that middle tier, those pieces. Everybody in that orchestra needs to have that information. or some sense of understanding. So whether you're a superintendent, a parent, a bus driver, those pieces are important to have. Okay, so we need to intentionally provide the knowledge and tools to create a welcoming, caring, safe, and respectful learning environment so that kids can learn. So it's kind of that enriched environment that we were looking at the end of Brian's information. So if we can do that, we're hoping that we can help that stress response kind of turn down a little bit so kids can learn, right? Because when it's heightened, they're not in a space where they can access the prefrontal cortex and be successful, as successful in school, okay? So some of the challenges are to create that environment, to identify the gaps, to be prepared to deliver age-appropriate interventions. And when I say for early years and subsequent development and academic gaps, those are things that happened in the early years, okay? But you've got a 16-year-old in front of you who needs some developmental skills. He's functioning, maybe he's about 6, okay? So how do we still respect his 16-year-old age? And then be prepared to go back through those challenges repeatedly. Oh, my alarm's going off. So the last slide is that in order for us to teach or to reach vulnerable children at school, we have to understand the complexities of the orchestra, that's the school system, and identify the level of understanding of current research and research-informed interventions of the audience that you're trying to reach. We have to work toward creating masterful schools and know where each stakeholder is on that RTI triangle model for efficiency and collaboration, right? So if you're aware of kind of what service you're offering and where that might sit, that can help a lot. So what do we need? We need to start with the adults to reach the kids, and it truly takes a village. That's it. Oh, Teresa.
So now for questions. Anyone in the room with questions? Take a mic over to my right.
Thanks. I really enjoyed your talk. That was really interesting. You're probably familiar with the Jacobs Foundation, which is a big funder of early childhood education programs and different kind of research on the early educational system and how that can influence child development. One of the things that they're calling for is personalised schools. It speaks to this notion of kind of personalised medicine or precision medicine, which is taking off in the sciences. And you touched on it at the end of your talk, but what do you think is the biggest barrier to us actually being able to introduce this kind of concept into education, this idea of personalised education programs for children?
Right. So it's a great question. And I kind of come from a bit of a maybe a cheat environment, because the school that I work in we have really low numbers of kids, so a really high ratio of staff to student, and so we're able to perhaps incorporate more of a personalized touch than most schools. I think it kind of goes back to the slide that I showed you, right, where we have 24 kids in the class in elementary school with a potential for up to 80% of those kids having additional needs, and that's not including the unidentified needs, right? So it's quite complex. I think it's a huge question. I think that it's every teacher's dream to do just that, and so I don't have an answer. I think it's a huge societal sort of question around that, but I am thrilled that these kind of conversations are happening, because I think that's where we'll see some of the change. If you go back to the RTI model, the better job we can do at that universal level of being really masterful around how we're creating those environments for kids, when we see that happening, we see the numbers shift a bit. So we see those kids that are receiving the targeted interventions be able to shift down into that bottom level, right? I've been into schools where that whole triangle was upside down, right? Where the red was huge and you had like these little bit of targeted kids and a little bit of green. And with real focus on that universal level, you can start to shift those numbers. So I think that that's where we always say we'd like to start, is how do we help get the message out so that schools can do a really good job of trying to create that entry point at the universal level, so that those numbers at the targeted and the individualized shrink a bit and become more manageable, right? I hope that helps.
We have a question online. If you could take the mic over to Amy.
Vicky Harbour is wondering if anyone knows if teacher preparation programs, university courses, are being introduced to this information, or if schools are actually having an opportunity to offer PD to teachers on this.
Hi, Vicky. I think that I can't answer to the university piece. I know that we have seen some, so maybe someone else can jump in the crowd. I know we've seen some teachers coming out of U of C with some exposure to some trauma courses, things like that, where they're getting a bit of exposure around those effects on the brain and development. As far as teacher access, again, I think it's becoming more common. It's kind of exciting. When I first started talking about this, I'd teach some kind of side courses at Chinook Learning for Adults. And when I first started, all of this information was brand new to people, and they would be shocked and surprised. And I just did one a few weeks ago, and it was amazing. The folks coming in were predominantly school lunch supervisors, EAs, educational assistants, and so on. And they had the basics. It was really cool. So it's coming around where they're starting to understand that piece of building relationship, really building those safe environments, and starting to understand the effects on development when we don't take the time to do that. So there are some courses out there, but it will depend on where you're at and who you can access. Yeah, Brian.
There are a lot of PD days that I've spoken at. I've spoken at the ATA in Edmonton. We'll be speaking again in Kananaskis. The University of Lethbridge has a master's program in education and neuroscience, a 2-year summer program. So these things are appearing.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. Okay, we'll have time, I remind you again, for questions for all of the panelists at the end.